Everybody here with this lovely microphone. Well, I'd like to welcome you all to this lovely venue, and I'm glad it's not the same weather as it was this morning. Some of you may have changed your minds. We are a new party. We're not a new party, we've been doing this for 13 years. We're a new party for some organizations like the BBC. They suddenly seem to have discovered us. Some other places that they realize they can't ignore us anymore, which they've been trying to do for God knows how long. One of the first things I always ask is, how many of you are not members? That's what we like to see. Now, I will be locking this door. And I do have membership forms here, which is how you then get out the door. There are 204 seats in this room, and I'm happy to say about 95% of that is full. It's been a great turnout. We have just finished our most successful party conference ever in Birmingham this past weekend. When they write the history books of this period of our country's history, one of the overriding achievement of UKIP to date is we have changed the political debate in this country. 7 years ago, 8 years ago, nobody said anything about leaving the EU. Good Lord, you wouldn't be invited for dinner again, or drinks, because you were weird. But because of UKIP, under the leadership of Nigel, we have changed the political debate. One of the polls over the weekend put us 2 points ahead of the Lib-Dems. These are things that nobody ever dreamed of 10 years ago. But they have happened, and it's going to continue to happen. If you want to know how we do this, it's just hard work. We are the party that delivered over 9 million leaflets, and the other parties didn't even know how to do that anymore. They do it occasionally on a by-election because they're all throwing lots and lots of money and they ignore the rules. But by and large, it was hard graft of a lot of our members. Sadly, some of them no longer with us, but they've all been working for the goal, and the goal is a free and independent Britain that we can hand down to our children and grandchildren. Unfortunately, some of them don't seem to understand what we're talking about sometimes, but that is changing as well. Our numbers in young independents are booming almost faster than our regular increase in membership. It really is impressive. And you just have to come to a party conference to see the change if you went to one 6 years ago, 7 years ago, something like that. We have various items for sale tonight, which will be on this table after the question period. One is Nigel's Flying Free paperback. This will be £8. He'll sign them for you if you want. There's a hardback edition for £10. There's mugs, bags, £3 each. And then the ever popular, almost infamous at this point, the damp rag. Who is this man? Who are you? Nigel will sign these as well. These are £5 each. If you have a favourite Tory or a favourite Dim Lib and you're looking for an appropriate Mr. President, you couldn't upset them more. We're now going to do a 3-minute little video. It's called The Best of Nigel, and then I'll introduce Nigel. Thank you.
Now on behalf of the EFD, Mr. Farage.
Well, good morning, Mr. Schulz. President Schulz, I know it's my job to congratulate you, but given that we knew this result 2.5 years ago, as a result of a stitch-up, there really doesn't seem to be much point. I mean, after all, nobody in Europe would ever, modern-day Europe, would ever have a big, powerful job that was decided by a full, open process. I'm sure Mr. Barroso would agree. I was musing this morning. I was thinking, what kind of President Schulz are we going to get? Are we going to get a dignified, calm, a figure that behaves like the Speaker of all great parliaments around the world, somebody who puts himself above politics and the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day arguments and is an ambassador, indeed a statesman? Or are we going to get the Martin Schulz we've got to know since 2004 as leader of the Socialist Group? You know the one I mean. Snarling, angry, unable to control his temper, intolerant of anybody with an alternative point of view, somebody who is contemptuous when in free referendums people have the temerity to vote no, somebody who is anti-British to his fingertips and doesn't like free markets. I was wondering which one would we get. Well, your opening speech has settled that question for me, and it's pretty clear. We're going to have 2.5 years of political fanaticism from the chair. And I have to say, only a third world country, only a banana republic would want to have an overtly political president of a parliament. But it's what we've got. I may represent the smallest group in this parliament, Mr. Schulz, but I can tell you that it's a group whose ideas and whose views are now being echoed by a growing number of citizens right across this continent. I'm sure you'd agree. The opinion polls show it's kind of 50-50 whether people think this EU is a good thing or a bad thing. What we represent, sir, is not anti-Europeanism. That is not what it's about. We believe in nation-state democracy. We want a Europe of trade. We want a Europe of cooperation. We want a Europe that is responsible. We don't want a Europe that seeks to be a global superpower. We don't want a Europe run by Mr. Barroso and the Commission and the so-called community method. And I will do my very best to provide political opposition to your presidency over the course of the next 2.5 years, and I hope you give us a fair hearing. Thank you.
Before we return to this room this afternoon, there is one more thing. As newly elected President of the European Parliament, those who stood against me, I have an offer for you, Mr. Deva and Mrs. Wallace. Because the campaign between us has been so fair and correct, I think that we should stay in very close contact. So it would be a pleasure for me if we could continue to work closely in future.
I think that was Mr. Deva that at one point thought he was going to be Secretary General of the UN. Anyway. Two more quick things. We have a very good new leaflet, what we stand for, on the corner here. We have a fascinating new DVD, The Hidden Local Issue. Next year, in May, we will be contesting every seat in England and Wales that we can, which will be about 99%, I think, for county council elections. And anybody that's thinking about it, or anybody that's just thinking about county council elections in general, these are things that we've never been told, never seen before, on what councillors are doing and how the EU has got their tentacles into the local election organization. It's truly horrifying. Now, we made the big change in British thinking. The man that is responsible for all that is you're about to listen to. You've just had a preview. Many of you have already seen him on many different YouTubes. He's a YouTube superstar. When we first elected MEPs, we found out they could only speak for 2 minutes, or 90 seconds, or whatever it was. Everybody thought that was silly, but that was before YouTube came along. Now we have a bunch of MEPs that are quite good at getting their point across in very small sound bites, and YouTube has just magnified that to the nth degree. It has been a great help, because we all know the local liberal media is not going to help. So these two things for county council elections, if any of you think would like to be a candidate, please see myself or Chris Latham over there for the local elections coming up next May. Nigel has a schedule that would choke a horse. We've been up in Birmingham all weekend, and now he comes down here tonight, speaking to you, has to get up first thing in the morning and fly to New York to give a talk tomorrow night, when he will turn around and fly back and be doing another public meeting in Bedford, and then on Friday it's Oxford for some school thing that I can't remember. One of the things I've learned in this job is don't knock the water over. Is don't work for somebody 15 years younger than you. It's very hard to keep up. He has an incredible capacity for work, an incredible capacity for homing in on what the issue is at the time. Ladies and gentlemen, Nigel Farage.
Thank you. Got my notes.
Oh, sorry.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Well, I must say, it's great to be here, and my congratulations to Chris of the local branch. Is that better? My congratulations to Chris of the local branch for getting the leaflets out, for letting people know this meeting's on. And I tell you what, on a wet, windy September night in Alfriston, I'm pretty confident that the local Conservatives, Lib Dems and Labour wouldn't get even a fraction of this number in one room. And that's fantastic. It shows that you care, and it shows that our message is resonating. Because, of course, just down the road in Brighton, the Liberal Democrats are having their annual conference. How I enjoyed the piece in today's Daily Mail by Quentin Letts, who said he'd been to bigger drinks parties. So it's interesting that we've got as many people in this room here tonight as the Lib Dems had in the hall for their national conference today. So we are making fantastic progress. UKIP's on the up, and historically we used to do really well in European elections. We did in 2004, and in 2009 we absolutely stunned the establishment by coming second across the entire United Kingdom. But we found it much harder with general elections, we found it much harder with domestic politics. But what has happened in the course of the last 2 years is that the people that want to vote for us in European elections now want to vote for us in county council elections, they now want to vote for us in general elections, and indeed, with that best poll that we had in the Mail on Sunday yesterday, that says there are now 4 times the number of people prepared to vote UKIP in a general election as there were just 2 short years ago. So we're having a very good time. I think partly that's because we've been jolly lucky with our enemies. Now I could, of course, go through them one by one and be personal about the whole thing, but I reserve that for European commissioners. But if you look at the so-called 3 parties that we've got, they look the same, they sound the same, they nearly all have absolutely identical backgrounds, which means, in most cases, coming from incredible privilege. But worse than that, of course, is they've never had a job. Never had a job. Because they all come out of Oxbridge and they go straight into a research office. They become members of Parliament in their late 20s. And they then, if they ever lose their jobs, of course, they're told, well, don't worry, old son, you can always become an MEP or perhaps a European Commissioner, which, by the way, I do predict is what will happen to Nick Clegg when the totally useless Baroness Ashton finishes in 2014. You know, we are being run by a political class who are, by definition, career politicians. They know nothing outside the world of politics, and frankly, I think, particularly in terms of the management of the UK economy today, it really shows. And in terms of policy, in terms of philosophy, in terms of, I mean, just 25 years ago, there were great debates in politics, weren't there? Huge ideological differences between Michael Foot and Margaret Thatcher. You know, and the point about democracy was, you paid your money, you took your choice. You got a government that would lead you in a direction. If you didn't like that direction, you were able to get rid of them and choose somebody else to take you in a different direction. That is what parliamentary democracy is all about. What we now have are 3 brands of social democracy. They're quite happy for the vast majority of laws in this country to now be made somewhere else. And they are absolutely gutless and spineless when it comes to standing up for the interests of this country and the people of this country. And I would say this to you, that above all, what we are in UKIP is a patriotic party that believes it's time we put Britain and her interests first. But that doesn't mean that because we say these things, that we're against anybody. You know, being patriotic means supporting your own side. It means backing your own people. It doesn't mean you hate or dislike other people around the world. And hasn't it been awful that for the last 30 years, if you dared to put a Union Jack sticker on your car, you were told you were a supporter of the National Front? And that somehow this was an embarrassing and horrible and awful thing to do. Well, I must say how pleased I am that all of that has changed. Because despite the political weather and despite perhaps also the economic weather, I think 2012 in this country has been a fantastic year. You know, just look at the Jubilee. A day a bit like the weather is tonight, with 1 million people lining the banks of the Thames. And then this sort of national outpouring of optimism, of hope, of belief that we saw during the Olympics. What a fantastic thing that was. And suddenly the Union Jack was everywhere, wasn't it? And patriotism is also not some narrow inclusive thing, it also brings people in. And the highlight for me of the Olympics was Mo Farah, not just for the 2 amazing triumphs, but for his attitude. You know, the BBC were doing their best to say that the Games were a victory for multiculturalism. Well, of course, the BBC would try to push that message, wouldn't they? But when Mo Farah was asked, wouldn't he really have rather run for Somalia, he replied by saying, listen, mate, when I put on the Team GB shirt, I feel proud, very proud. This is my country now. And what he did is he rammed their multicultural agenda straight back down their throats. Good for Mo Farah. He's proud to be British too. And isn't that a good thing for the future of this country? Now, there are some that have said over the years that UKIP are a pretty odd, eccentric lot. You know, we're obviously, I mean, I was once described, amongst the many other wonderful epithets that have been heaped upon me over the years, which of course include crank, gadfly, loony, fruitcake, extremist. One of my favourites was a Labour MP once described me as a paranoid reactionary living on the fringes of society. And this was all because apparently we were paranoid because we believed that the project which people had signed up to back in the 1970s that was called the Common Market, remember that, some of you? Yes. The Common Market, just about trade, don't worry your little heads, nothing can go wrong, no threat to British sovereignty. We said, and we've been saying ever since this party was formed, that actually it was never intended to be a common market, that it was perfectly clear from the European treaties that what they were going to do was to build a state. And a state with an army, and a state with a foreign policy. And we were told by the entire political class that we were mad, and that this simply was not going to happen. Well, let me say this to you. It's not that we're obsessed with the European Union, it's just that we recognise that we are now incapable of governing our own country as members of it. Because, as I've said already, 75% of our laws now get made somewhere else. And we've got a full manifesto for how we think an independent Britain could and should be governed. But it can't be governed that way unless we get that power back. Well, just 2.5 weeks ago, Mr. Barroso stood up in the European Parliament, and in the light of the euro crisis, which, folks, is disastrous. I cannot over-exaggerate just how ghastly things are in the Mediterranean for people stuck inside the Eurozone. Ghastly economically, particularly in countries where you've now got up to 60% of young people unemployed. You know, history shows that when you have large numbers of young people walking the streets, no good comes from it. A country like Greece, whose economy will contract this year by a further 7%, taking the top-to-bottom fall to over 25%. You know, when the Jarrow marchers marched on London in 1936, our economy had contracted by 12%. Just gives you some idea of just how desperate this situation is. But perhaps even worse than that, what the Greeks have had stolen from them is perhaps something even more important than money and work. They've had their pride and self-respect as a people stolen from them. How ironic that the country that actually invented the principle of democracy now finds itself governed by 3 foreign bureaucrats who fly in once a fortnight and tell the Greek Prime Minister what tax rates may be and what he may or may not spend. They've been humiliated to such a level that when their Prime Minister last year, Mr. Papandreou, dared to suggest that there should be a referendum so that the Greek people themselves could decide whether to stay in the Eurozone or not, within 48 hours, Barroso, my very good old mate Van Rompuy, and the rest of the bullying gang had a Prime Minister, a democratically elected Prime Minister of a Western country, removed and replaced by one of their own buddies. And they did exactly the same thing in Italy with Mr. Berlusconi. Now, what can we say about Mr. Berlusconi? Well, quite a lot, I suspect, but it's actually worth remembering that in the 50 years after World War II, Italy had 50 different governments. Berlusconi, for all his personal failings, had actually brought a degree of stability, in a way, to Italian politics. But Mr. Berlusconi, too, made some disparaging comments about the euro, and he was removed. And that trend, we've seen it building for years. The French had a referendum on the European Constitution in 2005. They voted no. They were ignored. The Dutch voted no. They were ignored. They just bulldozed it through and called it the Lisbon Treaty. And when the Irish rejected that, they were told to vote again. What we're up against here, ladies and gentlemen, is something that is not just vital to our national interests and our harmony and our democracy, it's actually vital for every other nation in Europe too. Because history shows us that if things go badly wrong across the Channel, it is always going to affect us as well. What we are facing, what we are confronting, is a new nationalism. These people have replaced their old flags with a European flag and a European anthem, and their ambitions know no bounds. And what Barroso said 2.5 weeks ago, for the first time ever, he stood up, the leader of the Commission stood up and used the F word. He used the federal word, the word that should, the word that should never speak its name. But he was clear. We're going to build a federal union where democracy would be transferred from the national to the European level. By the way, his definition of democracy is that people like him, who haven't been elected and can't be removed, will make all the rules. So, frankly, it's clear. The gloves are off. They intend to keep those countries trapped inside the prison that is the euro. They couldn't care less about the degree of human suffering that takes place in those countries. They will push on with what I now believe to be this very, very bad and deeply unpleasant project. They remind me in many ways of the communists that ran the Soviet Union. When it was absolutely clear that Soviet communism wasn't working, the Kremlin's conclusion was, we must have more of it. And we must continue with the project and just look at the suffering that happened there. So I want us to liberate ourselves from this union as quickly as we possibly can. But we have a slight problem, and that is called the established political class in Britain. The Lib Dems, Labour and the Conservatives have all repeatedly, over the last decade, at election time, made us promises that they were going to give us, the people of this country, what we deserve. A free and fair referendum so that we can decide our own future. Now, I think that referendum is vital. Vital for people over the age of 55 who voted last time in the Common Market referendum, because certainly my parents would like to vote again. They voted yes last time. Believe you me, they won't be voting yes next time. And there are 35 million of us under the age of 55 who've never been asked whether we want to be part of this European entanglement or not. So the referendum is vital. But the only way we're going to get that referendum is if this party, UKIP, becomes stronger and stronger. Because the only language that career politicians understand is the threat that they may lose their seats or lose their jobs. So that is what this campaign is all about. We have the possibility, folks, over the course of the next 18 months, if this party continues to grow, but at the rate it has been, we will force a referendum in this country. And I hope that all of you who believe in democracy, regardless whether in the past you voted Labour, Lib Dem or Conservative, I hope all of you agree that we are actually embarked here in UKIP on a noble mission, a mission that seeks to get back the independence, democracy and self-respect of this country. And I ask you, all of you, please, to support us and help us to get there. Because we've got to cut this Gordian knot, because there's so much that needs sorting out here. And I'm afraid the absolute dishonesty with which the entire political class are engaging the people of this country on the subject of the deficit is something that needs to be addressed. Yes. You know, we hear this debate, don't we, going on every day on the BBC about the cuts. For those that don't know the figures, and without getting too technical, let me just tell you what's going on in Britain today. We are not cutting anything. We are actually massively increasing the size of the national debt in this country every year. And the one statistic that I think is absolutely the most horrifying of all is this. If this coalition lasts for the full 5 years, in the space of that 5-year period alone, our national debt will have increased by 40%. And yet the BBC talk about cuts. And we have the sort of Pinky and Perky show in the House of Commons, you know, between the Labour and Conservative parties. Frankly, it's all baloney. Nobody is having an honest debate about the extent of the mess that this country is in. It's dire. We will be far more indebted in 2015 than we were in 1945. That is how serious this situation is. Now, we clearly have got to cut the size of a state in this country, but we also have to create wealth. And as I said to you earlier, when you have a parliament full of people who have never created wealth, who have never created a job, who've never taken a risk, then actually you've got the wrong people running the country. And one of the things that we believe in UKIP very, very strongly is that the absolute economic backbone of Britain are the 4.2 million people that run small businesses and act as sole traders in this country. And they're the people upon whom all the European directives fall. Whether it's employment legislation, whether it's health and safety at work, which frankly has reached levels for the building trade that are virtually insane, or whether it's the environmental dimension as well. And what we want to do is we want to get rid of all the excessive, protective, in inverted commas, employment legislation over small companies. Do you know, I was in Hastings the other week, going around a business park where there were 45 sole traders, people that were paint spraying, people that were redecorating antique furniture, I mean, all people that had gone out on their own, taken a risk, and were trying to get on in the world. They're just the sort of people the British government should be encouraging and helping. And I ask them all the same question. Are you thinking about taking on a youngster? And they all say the same thing. No, we're not employing anybody. We haven't got time to go to the industrial tribunal. We haven't got the money to pay for the legal fees. So we have a form of employee protection that actually now is discriminating against businesses taking on young people. And when you think about it, with youth unemployment in Britain running at 22%, with over 1 million of our own youngsters out on the street, you know, if just 1 in 4 of those small businesses felt they could give a school leaver a chance without being penalised for doing so, we could eradicate that problem. And that is the kind of thinking, folks, that you will get from UKIP. We want to help Britain's small businesses, but we can't do that stuck part of a European Union, frankly, with a legislative system that is discriminating against people getting back to work. And we've also got to have a proper, sensible, grown-up, mature debate about immigration. We really have. And again, whenever the word's mentioned, people lose perspective. Oh, it's awful, it's terrible, you can't discuss immigration. You know, there's something as if it was discriminatory to discuss immigration. It is not discriminatory to discuss immigration. And again, just some basic figures, simple basic figures. Throughout the 1980s and throughout the 1990s, until Blair got in, immigration into Britain ran at roughly 30 to 50,000 people a year. To be honest, it was a figure that was so small that you barely noticed it. It really wasn't that big. And then the Labour Party got in, and then the whole of Eastern Europe joined the European Union in 2004. And I was one of only 3 British MEPs that voted against that happening. Not because I don't like people from Poland, but because I think it's completely irresponsible to say to every single worker in Poland, if you want to come to Britain, you can come. Immigration since 2000 has run at between 500,000 and 600,000 people a year, and that number are still coming. Now, I think it is absolutely irresponsible at a time when we have a big oversupply in the unskilled labour market to allow that to happen. And I think what has now happened, where the social security rules have changed, where if you arrive at Victoria Coach Station from Warsaw, go and see the local authorities, say you're self-employed and looking for work, you claim for job seekers allowance on day 1 and housing benefit. And the message from this party is clear. We think that is discriminatory against British families who have paid into this system for generations. The National Health Service and Social Security should be for the people of this country, not for the rest of the world. And there's one other form of total madness and self-inflicted wound that we're doing to ourselves, and that is the whole debate over CO2 emissions and global warming. Now, I am not saying that we shouldn't care about the environment. We should. And indeed, I myself don't like very intensive agriculture. I myself think we really do need to work globally to stop the excesses of pollution and all of those things. And I used to regard myself 20 years ago as an environmentalist, until the whole thing went bonkers. And we started to convince ourselves that CO2 emissions were leading to global warming. Now, I'm not actually convinced that that's right, because one major volcanic eruption puts more CO2 into the atmosphere than we can in the course of a decade. But even if CO2 emissions were leading to global warming, you would not take some of the measures that we're currently taking. And here's one example. Wind turbines. Now, you know, the political class are in love with them. Cleggy thinks they're marvellous. That could, of course, be because his wife was a director for some years of the largest Spanish wind farm company. I've no idea. The Labour Party are signed up to them. Oh, and David Cameron believes in them so strongly that he even put one on his house in Notting Hill. Wind turbines do not lead to any reduction in CO2 emissions whatsoever. It takes a vast amount of carbon to actually construct them, particularly if they're offshore. And of course there is one major problem with wind turbines. They don't work in the middle of the winter when you get a great big anticyclone sitting over the North Sea and English Channel, when you have fog and frost and record low temperatures and record high electricity demand. And what don't you get with an anticyclone in the winter? Wind! So you have to back them up with conventional power stations, which have to operate for 365 days of the year to back up the wind turbines when they're not working. And the Germans went down this route before we did. They built 19,000 of these monstrosities, and now last year, because of that previously very cold winter, they built 6 new coal-fired power stations to back them up. That's greenery for you, isn't it? It doesn't work. And what it's doing actually, it's leading to one of the biggest transfers of money from poor to rich people we've ever seen in this country. Every single one of you in this room, whether you know it or not, is paying a 15% surcharge on your electricity bill through the hidden renewables obligation certificate. It's not highlighted on the bill, but it's there, and it's 15%. And that money goes to wealthy landowners who are bribed to put wind turbines on their land. And I'll tell you about one of those people. David Cameron's father-in-law receives £1,000 a day for just having wind turbines on his land, and all of you in this room are paying for it. It is complete and utter madness. We must stop right now this damaging, ugly, stupid insanity of wind turbines in this country. And it gets worse than that, because we're now penalising British manufacturing to the extent that when Chorus, the steel plant, closed down in Redcar last year, the company received 300 million of British taxpayers' money in the form of a bonus. They're called carbon credits for reducing CO2 emissions. And then what did they do the next week? Announced they were relocating to India. We're actually paying to deindustrialise our own country. And yet the entire political class are signed up to it. I sometimes think we're just about the only party that's actually engaged in any proper thinking that's going on. Now, there are many other things I could tell you about what we want to do. I could tell you that in education, we think the grammar school system served parts of this country brilliantly for centuries, and it's about time children who don't come from privileged backgrounds got the opportunity to get the best possible education. We also believe that whilst we want to keep our union, our United Kingdom, very strongly, that with devolution for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, that the English, frankly, are getting a rotten deal, and it's about time the English were given their own proper identity within that union. So there are so many things. There are so many things that we want to do. But, ladies and gentlemen, we will not be able to do any of these things, frankly, until first we face up to the reality that we've got to get back our self-governance in this country. Now, we as a party, as I've said before, are on the up, and we are now fighting elections seriously. We are going to fight every single county council seat in East Sussex next year in those elections. The candidates are coming in quickly, and if there are those of you in this room tonight that want to help us with that, please come forward and let us know. We will be fighting the Police and Crime Commissioner elections that are coming up on November the 15th. And indeed, we haven't announced yet for Sussex. We're in the process of choosing, but there will be somebody on your ballot papers here in Sussex from UKIP who you can vote for. We shall be saying that law and order and our attitude towards sentencing in this country has gone wrong. It's a sad thing to say, but it's true that the criminal base in Britain is higher now than it has ever been. And whilst we ought, with first-time offenders, to do everything we can through rehabilitation and education to get these youngsters back into the real world, there comes a point with some people who are career criminals where, frankly, it doesn't matter how nice to them you are, it doesn't matter what you do, they will re-offend. The one figure that I thought was, well, frankly, repulsive was the figure that was released recently that showed that of sex offenders who had been released from prison, having served only half their sentences, that in the last 3 years, 400 of those had committed rape again. It isn't good enough, is it? It just is not good enough. And we need to put career criminals away in prisons for longer, and if that means a prison building programme so that the rest of the population is safer, then that is what we must do, and that is what we'll campaign for in those police and crime commissioner elections. We will fight parliamentary by-elections. We're fighting one up in Corby at the moment. We will go on to the European elections of 2014, where, as I said, we came second across the United Kingdom in 2009, and it is my belief, hope and intention that UKIP can win those Euro elections in 2014 and cause an earthquake in British politics. All it needs, ladies and gentlemen, all it needs are people who believe in what we're trying to do. People who are determined that their kids and grandkids are going to grow up in a free country. People who actually want the rest of Europe to be free as well. All it needs is for those people to put aside their traditional tribal vote. You know, I vote Labour because my granddad did. I vote Conservative because I prefer them to Labour. It's all irrelevant. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter who wins the next general election the way we are. All we're doing in general elections is we're voting for a change of management in number 10 Downing Street, not for a change of government. So I ask you, all of you here tonight who are not members of UKIP, if you agree with what we're trying to do, please don't do nothing. Help us. Help us. We're on our way. Come and help us. We're going to succeed. We want our country back. And if you do, I ask you to come and help us. Thank you.
I'm sure most of you would agree with about 100% of what Nigel said. We will have forms here for membership again. We will have forms again in this corner for membership if you'd like to join. We'll have lists here for anybody that's interested in running for a particular seat for the county council elections. And I think it's time to move into question time. So what I'm going to do, if I know most of you that are members, so I'm going to upset you because I'm not going to call on you if I know who you are, because the point of this is for the non-members to be able to ask Nigel questions. Okay? So I'm not upset. I don't want to upset anybody, but you know what I'm saying. Okay. Can I go with the gentleman in the back and then you?
Are you aware that desperate mothers in Greece are actually giving their babies away to the state to look after them? Secondly, are you aware also that immigration does nothing to do with babies and aunts and uncles and the others coming in as well? And you say the first man in is doing self-employed.
On that point
I
about...
could just answer my question.
Well, I thought there were two questions there.
What's your view on work there?
Okay, first comment about Greece, you're quite right. The situation there is desperate. And when I met Angela Merkel last year and said to her, wouldn't it be better and fairer to liberate the Greeks by getting their own currency back, having a devaluation? Oh no, Mr. Farage, she said, we can't do that, because if that happens, other countries would leave too, and that would be the end of our European dream. And half of you is tempted to say, I'll drink to that. But the reality is, what they're saying is, we don't care how much suffering there is. The European project must succeed, and that makes them, in my view, very bad and very, very dangerous people. Yes. As far as workfare is concerned, one thing that really annoys me, and this started in 2004, when the door was open to Eastern Europe, they realised, Labour, they had a problem. Because their prediction had been that only an extra 13,000 people a year would come to Britain. Now we all knew that was absolute nonsense. So the Labour government started the myth that we need open-door immigration because British workers are all useless and lazy. That was the excuse that was used to defend open borders and mass immigration. And I must say, I think that is basically pretty damn insulting and offensive, because the vast majority of our young people are decent young people that want to work, want to live proper lives, and it's disgusting that the British political class should have labelled them in that way. I feel very strongly about that. But we do have too many young people, small as an overall percentage, but still too many in number, who have chosen the welfare state as an alternative lifestyle. You know, living on the dole, an awful lot of them engaged in drugs and other illegal activities on the side. And frankly, we can't afford that anymore, can we? I mean, given the figures that we talked about earlier, we can't afford that anymore. And I think it is reasonable and proper that if somebody who is able-bodied and able-minded, and yes, there'll be arguments on definition, but on the general principle, sir, if somebody is able-bodied and able-minded, they should not, after 6 months of receiving benefits, expect to receive those benefits without giving something back to the state in return. And if that means cleaning litter or learning a new trade, that actually, I think, would benefit everybody.
Lady in the red.
Well, actually, I'm going to be a bit personal now. My late husband, unfortunately, had Alzheimer's. And for 7 years, I had the most awful job of preventing the council trying to take my house away from me and getting help for this man who had fought in the last war, had never been on benefits or anything. For me to get help for him was absolutely dreadful, and I had to go to an MP in the end, and he sorted it out for me. So that, I wonder, what are you going to do about that? And then the other thing is, why don't we have more technical schools?
Okay, well, I mean,
to give you two
no. I mean, firstly, obviously, you know, not just my deepest sympathy, but that of the whole room as well. You know, you've found yourself in one of those positions that none of us want to find ourselves in, but I'm afraid increasingly large numbers of people do find themselves in. This and pensions are the two issues that the political class have just refused to look at. Do you remember in '97 when Tony Blair brought in Frank Field to examine all of this stuff? And he said, please, Frank, go away and think the unthinkable. And Frank did, and Blair sacked him. So, you know, we've got this massive problem of a huge national deficit, a country experiencing no growth, and a rapidly ageing and therefore ailing population. And nobody has thought through what to do. I do not have an absolute magic silver bullet to give you, because you know, we haven't worked it out either. Other than this, I think we're going to have to think about healthcare very, very differently. And I think we're going to have to move to an insurance-based system of healthcare. Frankly, I would feel more comfortable that my money would return value if I was able to do that through the marketplace of an insurance company than just us trustingly giving 100 billion a year to central government and expecting them to organise the healthcare service from cradle to grave for us. I just feel that with the whole healthcare service, one promise Blair did keep is he would increase expenditure. We've doubled expenditure on the NHS in 15 years. We haven't got, frankly, double the return. So, you know, if I had a magic answer, I could glibly say to you, don't give the EU 50 million quid a day and spend it on British pensioners. Now, you know, that would get a clap round the audience, but actually even that would not be sufficient to deal with the scale of this problem. So that's me being completely honest with you on it.
But there is a solution.
Go on.
It could be the people who need 24-hour care. There is a ruling at the moment under the NHS. The people like my husband who needed 24-hour care, they are supposed to get that free. Now you try and get that, and you will be very lucky if you do. And when I have friends who are in their 80s and one partner has got Alzheimer's, and the wife or the husband is doing what they can to look after that person, it's wicked that in this country they are not being looked after properly. And the answer is that you give these patients who need 24-hour care the care.
Well, I don't think anyone...
And it can be paid for by stopping these lazy kids that don't go out and get a job.
Well, listen, if we are going to be able to educate our people properly and to look after our people properly, we have to create wealth. We have to get away from this idea that profit's a dirty word. We need lots of people out of this country making lots of profits and paying taxes on those profits. And if we don't turn around the British economy, the problem that you talk about, whatever solution is found, will only get worse. But, you know, I'm not going to fob you off with a cheap answer. You've raised one of the biggest questions we face. It's a hell of a problem. On the second part of your question, listen, I think it's absolutely bonkers that again, all three parties agree, because they agree on everything, that they've been saying now for the last 15 years or more that we must send 50% of our youngsters to university. Now, I've always thought this is absolutely ridiculous, because what we did, so because we've sent more, we've now had to start charging lots of money for them to go, and I blame Maureen Lipman for all of this. No, I do. I do. Do you remember the ology? He's got an ology, right? So we now seem to think it's a better idea for somebody to leave university at 21 or 22 with an ology that possibly has no practical value in the workplace at all, and is not to a sufficient academic standard to advance them in the workplace at all, and all they've done, frankly, they might have enjoyed themselves, I know, but all they've done, frankly, is to waste 3 years of their life getting a qualification that doesn't help them, doesn't help the country, and they've got debt round their necks. This needs a social change in Britain. One of the things the Germans really understand is the value and the importance of skills and trades. You know, and if a 16-year-old boy or girl in Germany says to their mum or dad, I'm going to become an engineer, I'm going to become a master carpenter, you know, it's crack the champagne open. This is considered to be a badge of honour in Germany, and we turn our noses down in Britain at skills and trades. So I'm absolutely 100% with you on that, and I think we need to send fewer of our young people to university, only those that have really achieved the right academic level, and I think we need to encourage through tax incentives. It's back to my previous point about employment legislation. We need to encourage companies to give youngsters a chance to learn skills and to get into the workplace.
Good afternoon. Good evening, sorry. Professor David Young, I'm a report writer for UKIP and for the government on why, on various reports, we must get out of the EU. My last report, that took 3 years, has proved that we are now giving Germany 80 billion a year. That's nearly 7,000 per man, woman and child, which we could use that 80 billion a year for our pensioners, our armed forces, our doctors, our nurses. And the question that I have on that particular one is, why hasn't UKIP paid more attention to this in the press and really honed this point, is that we do not need to suffer, we need that 80 billion back. The second point of my question is the one where we, all government parties, keep on saying that the EU is important for work. That is the biggest lie I've been able to uncover. There is an effect, and remember this, called the Rotterdam effect. That means that any boat, any ship that stays in harbour for half a day is classed as goods entering the EU. I've been able to prove by this report that we only send 8% of our exports to the EU. We need to get out of the EU, and within 1 year of leaving the EU and claiming back our borders and our fishing rights, we would be able to put a minimum of 30,000 people back into work. Why hasn't UKIP used the Rotterdam effect?
Well, I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. It's very simple. Firstly, on the money. There are lots of arguments about money. I mean, you've got that figure. Professor Condon, who's with us, an economist, produced a report last week we may even have a copy of it here, he comes out with a bigger figure than you do for the total loss of the British economy, for the total loss of the British economy. Politics operates at a variety of levels. One level of politics are the academic debates that go on and take place on late-night programmes on Radio 4 and now on the blogosphere and elsewhere. But there's another level of political debate, which is what is my business, and my business is to try and understand these things, but to try and connect and communicate with the great British public, and to do so in a language that they can actually believe and understand. And honestly, I tell you this, when you tell people, when you talk in billions or trillions, and you can do it on the doorstep, I've tried it, but most people, the eyes glaze over. The numbers don't mean anything to them, because that is the academic battleground. But if I tell somebody on a doorstep, you know, that we're being governed from a foreign place, we've got all these rules being put upon us, Herbert Van Rompuy is utterly ghastly and still hasn't improved his dress sense since I had a word with him. And that into the bargain, Britain is paying a contribution of £50 million a day. That they light up on because they can get hold of it and they understand it. All right? Second part of your question is vital. When this referendum comes, and it's very important we get the right question, not some fudge compromise, but when this referendum comes, the key battleground will be this. For years and years and years, Blair, and now Cameron, and of course Clegg, argue that 3, or in some interviews 3.5, million British jobs depend on our membership of the European Union. And that if we left the EU, all those jobs would be lost. And how we deal with that is the key to us winning back our independence. My argument's very simple on this. The last year for which we have trade figures show that Europe sold us vastly more goods than we sold them. I'm going to use a billion here, I'm sorry about this folks, but I mean, the figure's 50 billion for 2010. You know, they economically need us more than we need them. If 3 million British jobs were lost because we stopped European trade, 6 million jobs would be lost in France and Germany. So that's the kind of economic, logical argument we've got to make. I also think, like just one more quickie on this, Steve, there's one other fact that British people do not understand about the EU, and it's this, that because we're part of something called a customs union, we are forbidden from making our own trade deals with the rest of the world. The EU has to make those deals on our behalf. And when you think about the EU, it's a declining part of the world when you compare it to all the growing economies in the world and how the world's changing. And one of the things UKIP says is, let's have a simple trade deal with Europe, but let's broaden our horizons. And we think a very good place to start would be a group of countries that now constitute 29% of the world's population, who speak English, who have common law, similar accounting systems, who stand by us when we're in trouble, and they're called the Commonwealth.
Lady and then that gentleman.
Yesterday in the Telegraph there was a poll on governments, both Nick Clegg and Cameron are determined to increase our foreign aid and put it into legislation. 70% of the people polled said they didn't want this, and I want to know what UKIP's opinion is. What are you going to do with foreign aid? Are we going to be stuck with the legislation if they don't in?
Do you know, I felt for years that on the foreign aid argument I was whistling in the wind, because people didn't want to believe it. I've been saying, I mean, Claire Short actually said it, that actually over half our foreign aid we don't even spend. The European Commission spends it for us. And given that they haven't had the account signed off by the auditors for the last 17 years in a row, you know, I mean, it's rather like putting an alcoholic in charge of the bar, isn't it? It's just madness, you know. I just want to say, Andrew Gilligan, who is the journalist on the Sunday Telegraph, has been exposing these figures over the last 2 weeks. I think he's the best journalist in Britain at the moment. He's shown that vast amounts of money are siphoned off, not just in Africa, but here. Here! People are getting very, very rich on the back of foreign aid. People think, when you talk about foreign aid, people think, oh, we're just being nasty to people. No, we're not. You know, if there's an earthquake or a disaster, I'm quite happy to give some money online. Quite happy to give some clothes. You know, disaster relief is different. But foreign aid is a continual check given on an annual basis. It was once best described to me that foreign aid was the transfer of money from poor people in rich countries to rich people in poor countries. And that, to me, is a very, very good summation of foreign aid. And when you think we're giving foreign aid to India, and they've even got aircraft carriers with Harriers on them. We're giving foreign aid to China, a country in which there are 150 billionaires.
We're giving foreign aid to Iceland and they owe us.
Well, you dropped me on that one. So I think really, given the strength of arguments, madam, that you've made, clearly you will be putting yourself forward as a county council candidate.
You didn't actually say what you do about it.
Oh, stop it! well, you know, we would stop it, of course. We would stop this idea that you send a steady check. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be philanthropic, decent
What about
Christian
they
people.
legislate so that it's in the Constitution that we have to do it? Will you?
I know about this. Listen,
Yes.
I take this simple view. We have existed for centuries in this country under the principle that no parliament may bind its successor. And anybody that tries to do that, as far as I'm concerned, has broken the British Constitution, and we should tear it up or burn it on Guy Fawkes Night or something.
The UKIP leaflet mentioned help save Britain's economy, okay? All three main parties talk about fairness when talking about the economy, but all their MPs allow fractional reserve banking, right? They just allow it. The Christian Council for Monetary Justice has said it is almost incomprehensible that governments should give privately owned corporations the right to create out of nothing the national money supply. And if this was put right, this lady over here would have had enough money to support her husband. What's UKIP's idea on that?
Well, look, I've touched a little bit tonight on what we're doing with the national debt. That is absolutely linked hand in glove with forced money creation. You know, I mean, I don't want to get too much into what we're doing at the moment with quantitative easing, but suffice to say, nothing we're doing is actually making the British economy any better. I suspect, sir, with the money printing that we've got, that there'll be a period in a few years' time where we go back to rampant inflation.
Absolutely.
And as we learned in the 60s and 70s, rampant inflation is a disease of money that is very, very difficult to stop. I personally think we've allowed the whole banking system, and through central banks too, to become massively overgeared. And I think there is a very strong argument that says that the Bank of England, frankly, needs to be reined in for its current activities. And as far as the whole banking system is concerned, I think the argument now is irrefutable that it is quite wrong to have a banking model where some firms become so big that when they go bust, we have to bail them out. The whole point about capitalism is that private money makes profit, but if it gets it wrong, it goes bust. And I think we have to break the banks up. I think we have to return to a system of investment banks or clearing banks. And like you, I am concerned about fractional reserve banking. I am concerned about forced money supply. We do need to get back to a much sounder definition of what money is than where we are today.
Answer to the Euro apologists who tell us that without the EU we might go back to war in Europe.
Well, yeah, I mean, okay, let's just remember that the road to hell is often paved with good intentions, and just as communism was a high-minded ideal, when they brought down the Tsar, they thought they were going to make a better, fairer world for themselves in Soviet Russia. In fact, what they got was something even more iniquitous, even more evil, and they finished up actually with a regime that killed 40 million of its own people. Euro-federalism was based on the idea that something must be done to stop the French and Germans scrapping every 25 or 30 years and causing misery across the globe. And as such, you know, I've always said this, I do believe it was based on a good ideal, but based on a fundamental flaw. And the flaw was this, sir. They believed that the existence of nation-state led to war, and therefore if you abolish nation-states, there'd never be another war again. The misreading of it was this. Had those European states been democratic nation-states, they wouldn't have gone to war with each other. War does not happen between mature democracies. War happens where, as in the case of Weimar, democracy breaks down. War happens where democracy doesn't exist and where one country is imperialist and expansionist, and that is what causes war all through history. And I would argue this, that far from this misunderstanding and high-minded ideal, living to a Europe of peace and harmony, it will do the very opposite. And what we're seeing now within the Eurozone, the tensions that now exist, I mean, who would have believed just 3 years ago that in a country like Italy, a major European country, they would portray Angela Merkel wearing swastika armbands? You know, who would have imagined that the hatred between the North and the South, you know, I mean, I often say that we all grew up with Europe being from east to west for the Berlin Wall. It's now split from north to south, and that's been done for the Eurozone. I would also argue, sir, that if you take away from people their identity, their belief, their self-respect, their pride, their democracy, that probably the only way they can get it back is to fight to get it back. And one of my biggest fears for this European project is it will spark a whole series of little mini-civil wars, as we've seen in Yugoslavia, over the course of the last 20 years. I really mean it when I say this project has, in my view, and I'm a witness to it at first hand, this project, frankly, now has become evil. It is not just bad for us, it is catastrophic for the future of our continent.
Thank you for coming, Dr. David. I'd like to say, how is the law now that we've let out a killer that's killed 2 PCs? Which judge? He was on remand. Why was he allowed out? Where's our law and order going? If you've got a judge who will do that?
I think there are a couple of answers. I mean, I did touch on this earlier, sir. But I think we, frankly, we've got quite a lot of judges at the moment that need to be sacked. I mean, the man that said he admired the burglar for his bravery, I mean, God help us. But there's one other little angle, and I'm going to finish on this if I can, because I think I've done a few questions for you. But just let me just finish if I can. There's one other very important aspect to the whole criminal justice system in this country, which actually has been rather a good one over the centuries compared with the rest of the world, you know, where we've actually had good basic rights through habeas corpus and jury trial and all the rest of it. But frankly, I believe that what the Human Rights Act has done is to turn the whole thing on its head, so that now judges, police, courts, prisons aren't actually sure what they can and can't do. And I think that the human rights agenda has had a very negative effect on criminal justice in this country. And frankly, there is a perception out there, right or not, that actually what is happening through so-called human rights is that the perpetrators of crime are getting rather a better deal than many of the victims.
Because it's never been published.
I don't know the name of this judge.
But I think somebody should find out.
Well, I would think that's a very good idea. And on their current form, the Sun newspaper will probably find out before anybody else, because they seem to know everything about Andrew Mitchell's life, amongst many other things. But I agree with you. It is some of these things that happen really are head-shaking moments, and I hope, I don't believe, but I hope, that with the Police and Crime Commissioner elections coming up in November, that we might just have a proper debate about these things, which is why in Sussex you will have a UKIP Police Crime Commissioner candidate, and we'll do our best to raise some of these arguments. And before Steve closes, I just want to say thanks so much to all of you for coming along this evening. And as I say again, you know, if you do agree with what we're trying to do about this, then please, please do something. You know, don't wait for 20 years to go by. And one of your grandchildren to say, what did you do when our country was being given away? Let's fight to get it back, shall we?
Well, thank you again for all of you who come. Don't forget, you can sign up here to be a member. Talk to the people behind this table.